What if George Michael reformed Wham in the 1990s? This week I'll be taking a little look at the career of Wham, one of the most emblematic pop groups of the 1980s, and taking a moment to look at the very different paths that George and Andrew took after the duo dissolved. All that and more on this week's What If, How and Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel, and then on Wednesday I follow it with one of these companion videos where I discuss the artists and genres involved in the What If video, and also share a little bit of my creative process. The idea of the What If videos is that every week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instrument I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Fast Love by George Michael, and I tried to reimagine that in the style of a 1980s Wham hit. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. Wham were definitely one of the first, if not the first, pop act that I ever became aware of as a small child when I first started just being aware of pop music in general. They definitely still have a bunch of hits that are so well known that they're just kind of part of the general consciousness, but if you weren't around at the time in the early to mid 1980s, it's possible now to be unaware of just how absolutely massive they were. They were formed in the legendary rock and roll mecca of Bushey in Hertfordshire. I think originally they were part of a larger band who never really amounted to anything, and then decided to separate from that and become a duo. George Michael handling lead vocals, playing keyboards as well, and Andrew Ridgeley playing the guitar and supplying backing vocals, and with a sound that really channels a lot of soul and funk and R&B that the two of them were particularly fond of at the time. I think when people look back at the 80s now as this very glossy, very surface level, very kind of greed-driven, capitalistic decade, you can look at the massive Wham hits and it's quite easy to sort of lump them in with that whole 80s ethos. But actually their early stuff, particularly some of the songs on that first album, are kind of quite socially conscious. Songs that reflect the experiences of the young working class in Britain, even whilst they also present a certain amount of escapist fantasy. If you'd never really paid attention to the content of their songs, they're actually surprisingly switched on, and in some respects a bit more closely aligned with the kind of Red Wedge movement that was being led by the likes of Paul Weller's Style Council than they were with the glossy hedonism of the New Romantics. So that first album made quite an impact with this glossy pop soul, but with some slightly gritty social underpinning, and then obviously the follow-up ups the pop glossiness considerably. That's, I guess, the point that I became aware of them as a little kid with Wake Me Up Before You Go Go, which, whatever you think of it, is just one of those undeniable, eternal pop radio classics. It's always going to be there. Just really goofy and upbeat, taking elements of 50s doo-wop and a hefty swathe of Motown. It's got that classic Motown shuffle thing going on to it, a bit of a James Jamerson kind of bass line in there too. It's very silly and it's extremely lightweight, but it's just a perfectly put together bit of pop, and understandably it was a massive hit. And kind of from that point onwards they were totally unstoppable. Really kind of, it's extremely dominant in the UK pop scene and managed to make some serious headway over in the States, and then also became the first Western pop act to go over and perform shows in communist China, which was, I think, a bit of a publicity coup on the part of Simon Napier Bell, who was their manager by that point. Only had a pretty short run, about sort of 5 years really in total, but the amount that they managed to squeeze in that time was pretty remarkable. I think ultimately they were never designed to work as a duo in the long term. As although they were really good friends, without wanting to be too mean to Andrew Ridgeley, there was just a massive disparity in talent between the two of them. Yeah, Andrew Ridgeley definitely pitched in with songwriting, particularly on some of the earlier stuff, but I think it was obvious from fairly early on that George was the guy who had the real gift. And they were great together for those few years with the sort of youthful, teen-oriented image, but you could tell that George Michael was maturing, wanting to do something a bit more serious, and I don't think Andrew Ridgeley was in any way capable of following him in that direction. There's the notable point where Careless Whisper gets issued as a George Michael solo single. That's kind of almost feels like sort of testing the water to see if people are ready for that sort of more serious, somber version of him, and obviously that was a massive success, which is pretty much the death knell of Wham, really. Just from that point onwards, it was obvious that George Michael had so much further that he could go with his songwriting, with his performance, and with his career, whereas Andrew Ridgeley had kind of hit his peak already, unfortunately. So I think the split was incredibly amicable, and they remained great friends. George Michael obviously embarked on his solo career, and Andrew Ridgeley didn't immediately pursue anything musically, although George was obviously the main songwriter in Wham. Andrew Ridgeley definitely has co-writing credits on several of their lasting hits, notably Careless Whisper, which I've definitely heard stories that George was the sole writer of that, but just decided to give Andrew Ridgeley a co-writing credit just out of the goodness of his heart, which does sound kind of in character for George Michael. Although I also read on Wham's Wikipedia page that Andrew Ridgeley allegedly came up with the chord sequence for that, so I don't know how much involvement he had in that, but either way, I mean, just with the royalties from that, he could probably just never work again, so I don't think he was in any rush to get on with anything else musically. It took some time to pursue his hobbies, including racing of some sort. In 1990, he decides to dip his toe back into the waters of music and releases a solo album called Son of Albert, which I must admit I'd been completely unaware of until I was just having a little read up in advance of doing this video. Needless to say, it didn't do tremendously well, unfortunately. It's an interesting one. It's Andrew trying to establish himself in his own way as a more serious artist, and he attempts to do this by becoming a bit of a rocker, turning up the guitars a bit, these really loud, bombastic, horrible start of the 90s drums everywhere, and unfortunately it's a bit clunky and a bit embarrassing. He's not got a voice for rock music. It's quite a feathery, kind of lightweight singing voice, and when he's trying to sound tough and rock and roll, it's just not convincing at all, unfortunately. So the album didn't do too well. I think it might have spawned a minor hit in a couple of territories, but overall a bit of a flop, and unfortunately that put him off so badly that he's never really delved back into the music world, save for he did appear with George Michael. They had a brief reunion for the encores of George's set at Rock in Rio in, I think, 1991, which is nice, but since then he's kept out of the music business, obviously got his own stuff going on, and fair play to him. Meanwhile, of course, his erstwhile partner George's solo career fared much better from the get-go. Those solo albums were tremendously successful. Faith and Listen Without Prejudice Volume 1 especially were absolutely massive, and he continued to do tremendously well all the way through the 90s and beyond. And his solo work achieved a lot of critical acclaim that maybe his stuff with Wham never did, and I kind of get that, but for me, it's always a little bit sad when someone who you know is absolutely great at coming up with perfect, catchy pop songs kind of self-consciously matures. I don't know if I'm explaining it very well, but I think it happens to a lot of people in pop. They start out with this bright, youthful music and then they hit a certain point and think, oh, I better tone it down now, I better get serious. I'm sure for the longevity of their career that makes sense, but there's always part of me that ends up just missing the fun. I'm sure there are bits of fun stuff in George Michael's solo discography, and you know, it's all really well done, tremendously tasteful. He was a fine singer who really handled that more sultry adult material very well. I can appreciate that it's well put together, but there's definitely a large part of me that would much prefer more finger-popping, upbeat Dayglow pop hits to sultry Armani-suited R&B slow jams, you know. Not all of his stuff may be for me, but I do definitely enjoy a bunch of those old Wham singles, and whichever way you slice it, he was absolutely a British pop legend. Well, yeah, anyway, that takes me to this week's alternative universe scenario. So, in my alternate timeline for this week, it's 1996. Poor old Andrew Ridgeley has been having a bit of a tough time because a few years ago, obviously, he made this debut solo album, which he was really hoping was going to get him back into a music career. Didn't pan out like he planned. And in this timeline, rather than just thinking, well, but maybe a music career isn't for me and moving on to other stuff, he's been determined that he's going to get back into the scene. So he spent the last several years frantically trying to create an indisputably great follow-up record. He's been buying hours and hours of studio time. He's been hiring the best musicians. He's been chasing around trying to get labels interested, but all of it's come to nothing. And in the course of all this, he's run through so much money that he's actually in a bit of financial trouble. And he's quite depressed about this. Looking back over the last few years, the one thing that gave him a real moment of joy was when he was invited to join George on stage at Rock in Rio for his encores there. And he's overcome by a wave of nostalgia and he thinks, maybe that's what I need. So gets in touch with George and just asks if he wants to at least temporarily get the band back together. And George, is a little bit hesitant. He's got his own thing going on. He's doing very well. He's kind of left that pop stuff behind, but he can't say no to his old friends. So they reconvene and George digs out this new song that he's written that he planned to use for his forthcoming solo album called Fast Love. On George's demo, it's a smooth, slick bit of sultry R&B, but when him and Andrew start working on it, they quickly change it around and turn it into this upbeat, finger-popping kind of Motown shuffle, very much in line with the kind of thing that Wham were doing back in the 80s. So they finish that off, get it released, and this burst of nostalgia causes massive enthusiasm among music fans, and the success of the single thankfully saves Andrew from his financial difficulties. So, in attempting to convert Fast Love into a Wham-style track, my first step as ever is getting an isolated vocal, dropping it into GarageBand, syncing up to the grid. Now, the vocal from the get-go was the sticking point with this. Couldn't find a very good isolated vocal of Fast Love. The only one I could find kicking around on YouTube was obviously not a studio isolated vocal. It was done with a stem splitter, so it's fairly low quality anyway. I made it worse with the fact that I decided to try and replicate a bit of that Wake Me Up Before You Go sound. So it meant in order to get it into that sort of bouncy shuffle rhythm, I was going to have to mess with the vocal quite a lot. And by the time I'd done that, it sounded even worse. So apologies for the fact that the vocal sounds so messy. The best I could achieve with what I was working with. Obviously, the Wake Me Up Before You Go kind of feel is pretty upbeat, so it meant speeding the vocal up quite a lot. But then that didn't work for the little bridge sections, the pre-chorus. So instead of being faster, those bits needed to be half time from the rest. So those bits have been slowed down a lot. And the whole thing is in this swung kind of shuffle rhythm. So I also had to manipulate the rhythm of the vocal around using the flex time feature on GarageBand. So it has been messed around with a lot. Once I got that done, next thing was some drums. I think the drums on Wake Me Up Before You Go, it's like Linn drums. So I tried to find just a drum machine sound in GarageBand that sounded a little bit along similar lines to that. Programmed some drums in, pretty simple, couple of fairly standard beats, not much in the way of fills, but just a couple of bits, just to further bolster the rhythm, because we needed that really big beat. I've got a few other little bits of percussive sound, so for the intro and like the little breakdown section, I've got some finger snaps, which I just recorded a couple of tracks of. We've got a tambourine that comes in. I always like to have a tambourine. And we've got some hand claps as well that all just come in at different points. And then in the end, I think we've got everything going at once just for that really big beat. Added some bass next. The bass on Wake Me Up Before You Go is, I don't think I even know who played it, but it's pretty tremendous. I can't play the bass that well, but I tried to at least get a bit of that feel there. So kind of Motown-y patterns for a lot of it, and then just a couple of twiddly fills up the neck as well. And a couple of little pops and slaps as well, just for that 80s feel. Next thing, I wanted some guitars in there, because obviously we've got to have something for Andrew Ridgeley to do. The guitars are pretty low key on Wake Me Up Before You Go, not mixed super high, and a lot of the time not doing anything too elaborate. So I tried to replicate a bit of that. I've got quite a thin, twangy sound with a bit of chorus to make it sound suitably 80s. And a lot of the time it's just doubling what the bass is doing an octave up. It just adds a nice little touch to the song. And then just a few little twangy, string bendy moments of lead. Certainly not solos, just a couple of little fills. And then in my mind, the keyboards on Wake Me Up Before You Go Go, I just kind of assumed that they were big glossy 80s synths, because that's what you expect in that era. But listening back to it, it's actually a pretty nondescript, low-key, sort of Hammond organ-y kind of tone. So for the keyboards on this, I tried to go for something a bit like that. So nothing too glossy, just fairly simple chordal things, just filling out the body of the song. And then on a separate track, I added just a couple of little more melodic fills and things to add a bit more colour in places where I felt it needed it. And then the last thing that I thought we needed was some backing vocals. The original vocal track that I used had a lot of the original backing vocals on, sort of, but it was so badly isolated that they were almost unlistenable. They were just really noisy and broken up, horrible. So I jettisoned most of those. So I had to re-sing the Ooh Baby Babies, which was very embarrassing sitting here on my own in the flat doing that. I hope my neighbours didn't mind too much, but got those done. And then there's sort of a breakdown section as well, where I felt we needed some slightly different vocals. So I've got some harmonised oohs and yeah-yeahs as well. Just the kind of thing that I thought Pepsi and Shirley might have sung with Wham back in the day as well. And for the video, kept it pretty simple this week. As ever, started off by just finding some footage of George back in the 1990s performing Fast Love. It looks a little bit comical the way I've used it, because obviously the majority of the song is sped up a lot, so unfortunately his stage moves are a bit Benny Hill, but wasn't much I could do about that. So we've got him singing the song, and then obviously needed some footage of Wham to intercut with that to make it look like we've got the band back together. So just used the Top of the Pops appearance of Wake Me Up Before You Go Go and intercut that with the George performance. So we've got later George, and then 80s Andrew Ridgeley plunking away on the guitar, Pepsi and Shirley there singing away, just trying to make it look like it's all one performance as much as I could. So I hope you enjoyed this one. As I say, I was a little bit worried about this just because that poor sound quality of the vocal does drag the track down a bit, I'm aware. But by the time I realised I couldn't make it any better, I'd already put a lot of effort into it. So I thought, I'll just finish it off and see what people think. It was good fun trying to recreate that Wham sound anyway, even if it didn't 100% come off. If you did enjoy it, please do let me know down in the comments. And if you could like, share, subscribe, all that stuff always really helps the channel. I do appreciate it. If there's anything else you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any artists or songs or genres you'd like me to investigate, do feel free to share your suggestions. I always appreciate them. Otherwise though, that's all from me for this week. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll hope to see you next time.